So I just want to do a quick recap here of the basic supply and demand diagram, and really this video is aimed to explain why this diagram is so important in the grand scheme of Econ 1, not just obviously for supply and demand questions, but for all sorts of topics including market failure, which is what this video is going to look at. So if we just remind ourselves very quickly that any of these diagrams include demand and supply, and that there are a number of factors, sometimes called conditions of demand and supply, and these are the things that cause the lines to shift. So we've got our demand side factors over here. So these factors here will cause demand to shift left and right, and we've got these supply factors here, which are the ones that will cause the supply curve to shift left and right. So ones that are particularly significant in the context of market failure is going to be this one, which we haven't talked about a great deal thus far, but the role of the government in terms of taxation and how that can affect the supply curve will become very important. But we know that when we've got our supply curve and our demand curve, we have our equilibrium set. That gives us our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity down here. And it's important when we think about market failure that we think of this Q as obviously the amount of goods being traded, and therefore it represents the amount of resources that the economy has allocated to the production of that good. The more of the good is produced, the more is needed to actually make that amount of the good. And market failure is essentially the case where there is the wrong amount of resources being allocated to the production of that good. So let's have a look at market failure in a little bit more detail. So if we think about a situation here about how we can demonstrate market failure on a diagram, and basically what we have to think about is this question here. What if there were extra costs or benefits which were not considered? So we've said that in a market there will be supply and demand, but obviously the supply and demand is based on the benefit that people think they will get from a product, or the costs that people think they will incur by producing it. What if there are actually extra costs or benefits which, for instance, are not being considered? Let's say, for instance, your demand for education. Now, you will have a demand for education, but it's entirely possible that that certainly when you're starting school, when you're 4 or 5 years old, you have no idea really of the benefits that will be received as a result of your education. And as a result of that, you probably actually won't consume the right amount of it. If it was left up to you at 4 and 5, you probably wouldn't go to school, which implies that your Q, the amount of hours of schooling that you were receiving, would be far too low. And the reason is that in that case, you are not correctly interpreting the benefits that you receive from your education. And what that essentially means is that your demand is lower than it should be. So your demand in this case, we call your private benefit. The M is marginal. We'll talk about that a little bit more in due course. But this is the benefit that you perceive that you receive from having the education. So I suppose let's call it perceived. So that's your perceived benefit. But in reality, of course, you actually get much more benefit. And that should mean that actually your demand curve would be up there. So we can call that the actual marginal private benefit, where you actually should be demanding the good. And if we take the equilibrium on that point there, we can see that the price people pay should be higher, which again is kind of represented by the fact that they undervalue it, although the price here actually is less important. The important thing is this Q1 here, because what this means is that Q1 is the amount of this good that should be consumed, but only Q actually is consumed. So we have a gap here. A gap between the amount of the good which is consumed, Q, and the amount of the good that should be consumed, Q1. And this is referred to as under-consumption. And it's an example of allocative inefficiency. It's market failure because more resources should be allocated to the production of education if we are to receive the full benefits of the education services that we have. So let's go on and have a look at that in a few other applied examples. So we're going to look at a few different situations and see if we can apply that same sort of thinking to them. So we're going to go for children's diets being too salty, pollution from cars, pollution from the production of rare earths, and people saving for their pensions. And we're going to apply that same sort of analysis. So let's start with children's diets being far too salty. So in all of these cases, we need to start with our basic market diagram. So we start with our supply curve and our demand curve, and remember that in this case we're talking about our perceived private benefits. So what's going on in this case then? Well, in the market position, it means that P will be being paid and Q will be being consumed. So what have we got? What's the problem here? Diets are too salty. That suggests that the children, certainly, and quite possibly the parents as well, don't appreciate the full dangers of this saltiness. What does that mean in terms of demand and supply? Well, it means they are demanding it more highly than they should be, that they are perceiving their benefits to be greater than they actually are. If they were to take account of the dangers of the increased salt intake, then it's quite likely that they would actually demand less of this. So what we can call the actual marginal private benefit. So the actual curve, D1, this takes account of the fact that there are additional harm done by the consumption of salt. What does this mean? It means that, again, we have this difference here. We have the market, meaning that Q of these goods are being consumed, and in actual fact it should only be Q1. So that means we have a situation of overconsumption. Or to use other words, we have a situation where too many resources are being allocated to the production of these goods, and therefore we have allocative inefficiency. And in this particular case, it's because salty food would be called a demerit good. And a demerit good is a good where the people consuming it do not fully appreciate the costs that they themselves incur as a result of the consumption of the good. The result of it being that we have overconsumption. So that's that situation. Let's move over here and let's think about this situation. So once again, we'll start in the same way with our market diagram. So once again, we start in a situation where we have our market equilibrium, this being the amount that people will consume under the free market conditions, Q. So what's going on here? In this case, we've got pollution from car emissions, which is causing a great deal of problems. So in a similar way here, we have additional costs that are not being taken account of in this situation. And the result of that is that people are perceiving the benefits to be at D, whereas actually, if they were to take account of the harm that they are doing to others, then their demand would be at D1. Now, the reason here is slightly different, because these additional costs that are not being taken account of, they're not costs which are actually felt directly by the person doing the consumption. So the person driving the car doesn't directly get negatively affected by the pollution which is generated. These costs are on society. So the MSB refers to the marginal social benefit, and we can see that the social benefit of driving is much lower than the private benefit of driving. The result, once again, is that we have a situation of overconsumption from Q to Q1, and this time, though, it's due to a negative externality of consumption. So in terms of the diagram, it looks basically the same. And the outcome is broadly the same, the fact that we end up with overconsumption and market failure. The cause, though, is slightly different. In the salty one, it was because people were unaware of the costs to themselves. In this situation, it's because they're not taking account of the costs to others. The end result, though, in both cases is the same, that people consume too much of this product and we end up with market failure. So let's move on and consider this situation. So in the situation that I've got here, we are talking about the production of a good now. So because we're talking about the production of a good, we are now thinking about supply, and we are thinking about that as being the marginal private cost of production. And then we have our demand curve, like so. As before, we have our market equilibrium, the amount that will be produced under free market conditions. So what's gone wrong here then? Well, under these circumstances, what's gone wrong is that the producers are not taking account of these external costs that they are imposing on the people around them. So it talks about the chap here whose neighbourhood has become unusable because of the pollution and the damage to local water and so on. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there are greater costs here than the firm is taking account of. As we saw with the pollution, though, these costs are imposed on people around the firm, not the firm themselves. So the result of it is that their costs are higher in reality than they perceive them to be. Okay, and as a result of that, their supply curve is too far to the right. Their supply curve should be the marginal social costs when we take account of these additional costs to the local residents. And the result of this is, once again, that we have a situation here where we have overconsumption, overproduction in this case, because it's the firms doing it. So we have overproduction, and this is still referred to as a negative externality. But this time, as you would probably imagine, it's a negative externality of production. So we have a situation here where there is a negative externality of production, and as a result, supply is further to the right than it should be, meaning that more of this good is produced than should be the case. And the last one I'm going to look at here is people saving for their pensions. So, once again, we will start with our diagram like this, and mark on our starting equilibrium as per usual. So that's here. So what we can say is that in the market situation, people will save Q amount for their pension. However, what they've probably done here is that they have underestimated the benefits of saving for a pension. Most people in their 20s don't really appreciate fully the importance of saving for a pension, and as a result of that, they underestimate the benefits that they receive. So what this suggests is that actually, if they were taking account of these benefits, then they would actually demand at D1. So if we are considering the actual benefits that they receive from the pensions, then they should actually be saving Q1. And here we have a situation of underconsumption. People underconsume pension products because they don't fully appreciate the benefits. These sorts of goods are called merit goods. So we saw demerit, where people are unaware of the full harm of consuming something. The situation that we have here is a merit good, where people are unaware of the full benefit. So that just shows how we can use supply and demand analysis to analyse the various different forms of market failure. And the next slide is just going to sum up a little bit about the various options. So let's sum things up a little bit here. You'll see the reason for the cross in a moment. But failure is allocative inefficiency. Okay, so anything which is allocative inefficiency is an example of market failure. That means that there are either too many or too few resources being allocated to the production or consumption of that thing, which means there is either over or under production or consumption. So any of these things, okay, are ways of describing market failure. So let's just go through and summarise very quickly the options which are available. So we can group them into four main categories. Start at the top right. Positive externalities of consumption and merit goods. What have we got going on over here? Well, we have a situation where demand is lower than it should be. Okay, in the case of positive externalities, it's because external benefits aren't being considered, and in the case of merit goods, it's all benefits, including private ones, which aren't being considered. And the result of that is that demand will be to the left of where it should be, and there will be under consumption. Under consumption. Okay. Going down to the bottom right then, positive externalities of production mean that supply is lower than it should be. Okay, the firms are not taking account of the full benefits of them producing the products, and as a result of this, there will be underproduction. And again, market failure. Bottom left, you can probably figure this out now, supply is higher than it should be, resulting in overproduction. We saw that in the example of the rare earths being produced in China. And in the top right then, in both of these circumstances, we have a situation where demand is higher than it should be. And therefore we have overconsumption. And that's because in the case of a negative externality, people aren't taking account of the costs that their consumption imposes on those around them. And in the case of demerit goods, they're not taking account of the full costs to them themselves of consumption. So that's kind of a quick summary then of the main forms of market failure and how we can demonstrate them using a slightly more advanced supply and demand diagram.